How do you? Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to move on now and hear from some folks with the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council. We have Nick Bennett at the head of the table at the moment. We'll go around the room and just quickly introduce ourselves so that you know who we are, and then we'll let you. Hello, I'm David Durfee. I'm the committee. I represent Shaftesbury, Sunderland, and Glastonbury in Bennington County.
Rodney Graham, represent Orange 3, which is Williamstown and Chelsea.
Jed Lipsky, represent Lamoille 1, Stowe.
Henry Pearl, I represent the towns of Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
Charles Wilson, Caledonia 3, Lyndonville, Sheffield, Wheelock, Sutton, and Newark.
I'm David Templeman, Orleans 3, which includes Barton, Brownington, and Westmore.
Josie Levitt, Grandal, Chittenden, all of Grandal County, and a little bit of West Milton.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland District, Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
Esme Cole, Windsor 6, Hartford.
Representative O'Brien, do you want to unmute and say hello?
Sure. Representative John O'Brien at home with COVID. I represent Royalton and my hometown, Tunbridge.
And we hope you're feeling better this morning. We have Laura Rich here helping us run the meeting. And welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Nick Bennett. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Mountain Bike Association. I also co-chair the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council. And I'd also like to let Cindy, who's the treasurer of the council, introduce herself as well. She should be on Zoom.
Good morning. I'm Cindy Locke. I'm the executive director of VAST and I'm the treasurer of the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council.
Good morning. We're glad to have you with us as well.
Thank you.
And before we jump in, just to the chair, would you prefer us to pause and take questions as we go or wait till the end to kind of lump them all together?
How long, if we just went right through, how long would your presentation likely be?
Probably about 15 or so minutes, 15 to 20 minutes.
Well, we've got plenty of time. Why don't we hear what you've got to say, and if there's anything that any acronyms that slip out, or
there's a lot of acronyms, so we'll do our best to try to.
I heard VAST, which I think I know as Vermont Association of Snow Travelers.
Yeah.
Okay. I may interrupt if it feels like the committee is not following something, but.
Yeah, and from our end, we're more than happy to jump into and take questions as we go, but it sounds great. Wonderful. Well, first off, thank you for having us. We're delighted to be here. We know with some of the committee reshuffling that I think outdoor recreation is likely to be a topic that you all see in a number of bills and certainly policies that will influence outdoor recreation. So we're really here just to introduce who we are, the role we play in the outdoor landscape of Vermont, and get a chance just to help let you know what we are, or who we are and what we do. And on that note, I'll start off with, if I can, there we go. So about us, about the Trails and Greenways Council. So we're the consolidated expert voice for recreational trails in Vermont. As of last year, we represented our member organizations, I should say, represented over 50,000 individual members. We logged over 100,000 hours of volunteer time. Collectively, we managed and maintained close to 8,000 miles of trail in Vermont. We support over our 50,000 jobs throughout the state through the impact of what we do. And then critically, we steward trails on private land, and those trails on private land represent over 70% of the public access trails in Vermont. We also partner closely with state and federal agencies to manage trails on public land in a host of other capacities. And we have Becca Washburn from FBR here as well today, which is wonderful as we have a very close working relationship with Vermont Forest Parks and Rec. In terms, I mentioned our members. So we're comprised, the Trails and Greenways Council, of over 50 trail-related organizations and individuals. And I've included some of the logos off to the right, but those include 18 statewide trail stewardship organizations like the Vermont Mountain Bike Association or the Vermont Association of Snow Travelers, VAST. We have 10 regional trail stewardship organizations, a half dozen local and community groups that build and maintain trail. We have a number of townships and municipalities who themselves steward trails. We have a host 7 state and federal agencies participate on the council as well. And then we have a number of individual and community and commercial members who are either involved in the building of trails and individuals who have an interest in trails as well. So we have a pretty broad collection. We meet annually once a year to really gather the input. We conduct surveys. We have board meetings that are open to our membership every month. So we really pride ourselves in being able to capture that collective voice of the trail stewardship community in the state. In terms of the board, just who actually kind of steers the ship, there are two of us here today. Myself, I run the Vermont Mountain Bike Association. I co-chair the council with Danny Hale, who's the director of the Vermont ATV Sportsmen's Association Motorized Group. We also have Mariah Kagi and RJ Thompson, who serve as co-vice chairs. You'll see a lot of co here, and that's because we try to share as much of the water carrying as we can. Cindy is our treasurer. Greg Western, who runs the Cross Vermont Trail, is our secretary. And then also on the board, we have Abby Long of Kingdom Trails Association, Matt Williams of the Catamount Trail Association, Katrin Maloney, who was on the board of the Belmont Trail Collective, Carolyn Lawrence, who's the director of Stowe Trails Partnership based in Stowe, Rachel Batts, who's the recreation director for Dorset, and then Rosie Metcalf, who's one of our community representatives. And wanted to share this just to get a sense of, again, the breadth of organizations that participate on the council. In terms of where we wanted to start, a little bit about the need. You've probably heard a lot about the growth in recreation over the past couple of years in Vermont, or really state across the country, and nowhere is that sort of better demonstrated than in Vermont. There's been a dramatic increase in that demand. That's not been just due to the pandemic. It's really something we've seen over the past decade or so, this growth in really the usage of outdoor recreation and the degree to which people rely on it, not just for health, but for state economies, for social, really defining the social fabric of communities. Where we are now, over half, in a recent survey conducted by the Outdoor Industry Association, over half of Americans, 54%, recreated outdoors in 2021. And that number has increased every year since 2014. So it's been a steady rise of those that are getting outside, hiking, biking, snowmobiling, what have you. Vermont specifically is a regional epicenter, as folks here are probably aware, for outdoor recreation. It's a 5-hour drive from over 80 million people, and that's one of the reasons it's become a huge driver of tourism here. Recent report by the Bureau of Economic Analysis showed that the outdoor recreation in the state accounted for $1.53 billion in spending. So that was 4.1% of state GDP, and that's behind only Hawaii and Montana. So that's a pretty elevated company in terms of states that really define themselves through outdoor recreation. From our user groups, so trail usage specifically, across usage types, motorized, not motorized, when we look at our data, we see that over the past sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen usage increase between 2- and 3-fold in terms of the folks actually out there on the trails. And as I mentioned before, over 70% of those trails are graciously hosted by private landowners who rely on their permission to access trail networks that the public enjoy. And I included a little bit of data just off to the right. One is a specific, this is the no-name backcountry area down at Brandon Gap. That usage has increased in terms of visitors from a little over 500 in 2017, ticking up every year to where in 2020 it was well over 900 visitors participated in backcountry skiing down there, Brandon Gap. Trailforce, which tracks really predominantly mountain bike usage and check-ins essentially through an app. That usage has dramatically increased as well from 2018, a baseline of around 150,000 to where in 2022, we're up to nearly 600,000 visits from mountain bikers throughout the states. And those are just individuals using this Trailforce app when they check in. So the true usage and the true ridership, at least on mountain bike trails specifically, is much higher. We have a lot more specific examples in terms of networks like Blueberry Lake, which have itself between 2017 and 2021 grown 150% in usage. We've seen stickers for ATV use, which are required to use ATVs on private lands, similarly go up by around 150% over the past 5 years. So demonstrating, or just the data here is intended to indicate that recreation has been growing dramatically. Folks often look at the pandemic, was that a blip? And one of the things we definitely noted from last year that it's not a blip, it's something that's increased. And I'm sure you perhaps heard from the state that on state lands, the trends are similar in terms of usage really growing dramatically. So with that in mind, I mean, one of the things the council is here looking to legislators too, and really to have a dialogue around is just we're seeking the support and really an active dialogue and how policymakers can really help ensure that we support a sustainable path forward for trail stewardship. Our organizations have continued to meet the challenge of stewarding and building new trail and maintaining the existing trail we have to meet that demand in recreation. But we are, we're approaching a breaking point in terms of when you talk about doubling and tripling of usage, and our organizations trying to keep pace with that demand. And so what does stewardship mean for us and mean for the council? Briefly put, it's maintaining trail infrastructure through private landowner relationships and public land manager partnerships. In principle, what our organizations are really guided by is this idea of balancing equitable access and responsible use. So really thinking about the environmental and social impacts of trails and also ensuring that we're providing this incredible resource that has economic and health and social value. All of our organizations were really rooted or are committed to applying rigorous best management practices. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but we'll refer to them. One of the acronyms here, BMPs, trail for design, construction, use, and maintenance of trails. One of our roles is to advise and it's a statutory role to advise the Agency of Natural Resources on matters related to outdoor recreation. In that vein, we co-manage the Vermont Trail System, VTS. There's yet another acronym, which VTS represents the public, the officially designated public access trails in Vermont. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. We provide input to policymakers to help guide legislation and provide that perspective of private landowners and our organizational members. And we continually work with members and external stakeholders to really look at those best management practices and understand how can we continue to do well and to do better in how we're stewarding trails in Vermont. I mentioned before landowners, and we really wanted to dedicate just a moment here to speak to talking about private land ownership specifically. So as I mentioned, I believe twice now, more than 70% of Vermont's public access trails are on private land. So our individual members of the council, whether they be VASA, VAST, VIMBA, any number of V acronyms, we establish and cultivate long-lasting relationships with landowners. And that's essential because this is not officially designated public land. These are landowners who agree to open up access, and the sustainability or in the long-term sort of security of that access is really predicated on relationships with our organizations. Individual trails could cross dozens of parcels. The picture on the right here is in the Brewster River Valley, where you've got a host of landowners that work together to provide trails for their community. Landowners receive no real direct benefit for hosting trails. So we'll talk about the next bullet, limited landowner liability, but there's no tax break for similar to current use where you get tax relief for agriculture or for forestry or for conservation. So they're really doing it. They've identified a value to communities to provide these trails, but currently provide no real benefit, which, as I'll mention in a minute, creates challenges with the stickiness of these trail networks. As I mentioned, a lot of the time it's predicated on individual relationships. If a landowner were to withdraw access, in many cases, there's no consequence for that. Or there's no downside, I should say. The fourth bullet here, limited landowner liability. Vermont has one of the strongest landowner liability protections in the country, and that's extremely important for us. It was passed early on in the early aughts, a bill that really strengthened that landowner liability protection. For a landowner has to do the equivalent of conduct wanton and willful misconduct to be responsible for injuries that occur on their property. And that allows landowners to feel comfortable to say, yeah, I'll let folks recreate on my land without being worried I'm going to get sued if somebody gets injured. We really pride ourselves on maintenance, access, and co-stewardship plans with landowners. So the tens of thousands of landowners that host trails across the state, a huge number of them our individual organizations work with them to create plans, come up and really meet the landowner where they are. In some cases, they say, do what you want on my land. I'm happy to have you all sort of develop and create trails, keep me posted. And others are really more interested in having more of a hands-on role in terms of that actual stewardship and helping design and build and take part in the trail stewardship. One of the important things we do have, our organizations, VAST really pioneered this, and then VIMBA as an organization and many of our other member organizations have similarly adopted them, are these landowner access agreements. So we have crafted agreements with landowners that essentially say that put them in, agree to host for a minimum of 5 or 10 years public access, which helps allow us to secure public funding, RTP funds, recreational trails program, funding for trails on private land. So that has brought important public support for those trails and allowed those networks to grow. And then lastly, at the council, we really pride ourselves on serving as a voice for landowners. So when topics come up that affect landowners, we can provide that voice given how many we speak with and work with individually. We can provide that perspective.
Nick, why don't we pause there?
Yeah.
You have given us a lot already to think about and see if there are questions. Representative Lipsky.
Nick, maybe it was back a slide where you referenced, I think, like 1.2 billion.
In the economic impact?
Yeah.
Yeah, 1.5.
I'll get beyond that, but that does not include like downhill skiing, the ski industry, or does it?
It does. I believe that's the collective bucket. They say outdoor recreation for all outdoor recreational activities in the state. So yeah, it's a pretty big.
But it does include the alpine ski industry.
Yes.
As well as like Craftsbury or Trout. But I can testify, was active on Stowe Land Trust for a 9-year term and active in, recovering some of the carnage from extreme events on the northern end of Katy Hill. And I acknowledge that our last guest, how an ornithologist came at the 10th anniversary of Katy Hill to do a tour and walk. And I'm walking elderly folks talking about forest succession and ecology. And we had to stop and step to the side because it was like the mountain road on a powder Saturday. Like within 8 minutes, $100,000 worth of mountain bikes passed us. Some were kids, some were their young parents, some were middle-aged, some were even closer to my age. But it has become a gigantic, and when I with fat bikes, it's 12 months a year, but from when the trails are dry enough and open, it is changing the economy, the recreational economy. I'd have believed that was without the ski area. It's the carbon footprint, but the pickup truck, when you used to have a ski rack on their car, well, now they got a little mattress hanging over their tailgate and about, $20 grand worth of bikes hanging off the back. It's all over. That's not just Stowe. NEK, it's everywhere. So that impact and it affects restaurants, farms, hotels, motels. It's a big impact, positive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that some of the impacts here are those secondary effects that you mentioned, where you have towns that have embraced, whether it's Pulteney, whether it's Stowe, whether it's East Berwick, where actually recreation has taken a center stage. There are all those secondary benefits to stores. And
that 2-year growth on the Trail Forks check-in, what industry grows by 100%? Or doubles in 2 years?
Yeah.
And it's been doing that. It's not like it's plateauing.
Yes, Dave.
How do you find balance between competing interests, like say, the hunting and trapping group to the, mountain biking group to the motorbiking group? I mean, there seems to be a lot of different cultures and energies you would have to balance.
Spot on. Yeah, I think that it's a really great point that they're different, and we think about them as in many cases complementary, but in some cases competing uses for the forest. The forest has many purposes. There are some uses. Forestry is a great example. We're very compatible with forestry in terms of we work with land management plans to figure out, okay, let's coordinate around those activities. Trails can be, particularly if logging is done well, can be rebuilt or sort of cleaned up and reused. Conservation, similarly, in many cases, depending on the purposes of like a conservation easement, recreation is perfectly compatible. In other, there are areas that are intended to be more wild or trailless or what have you, and we have to respect and consider that usage as well. So for us, it's about, and it's another role the council plays, it's having active dialogue with those groups, with conservation organizations, with backcountry hunters and anglers, for example, or those more backcountry trailless recreation groups. And trying to meet and understand when we think about a parcel, or we think, and where we're really working now and putting a lot of energy into is trying to take that really step back or even 2 steps back to have a sort of a statewide perspective. And this is where our partnership with FPR and other groups, which we'll talk about in a bit, is really critical to say, how do we take that thinking exactly as you described, which there are a lot of different competing uses, and how do we find times when they're well aligned and we can do things together, and times where it's about sharing. It's about recognizing that need to share the woods, really.
Representative Cole?
Are you involved in any initiatives to help get lower income folks access to these kinds of activities?
That is an excellent question. You had mentioned $10,000 amount or $100,000 worth of mountain bikes rambling down the trail. Some of these activities are extreme. Hiking is a very low barrier, and Green Mountain Club is a member, and it's important to think about sort of shortening the distance from a person's front door to the trail or the woods. So 100% agree with that. In mountain biking specifically, I was on through my member organization, VIMBA, on a call last night discussing exactly this, how we're working with local bike shops to provide bike vouchers, work with them to say, what's the minimum cost where we could grant subsidize individuals that are financially limited to come and say, let me get a bike for the day and go ride and experience this. And then many bike shops themselves have programs. Old Spokes Home is a good example, where they can actually work with individuals if they qualify to buy equipment, used or new equipment at discounted rates. So there's an acute recognition that, and many organizations have as part of their sort of commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, this, how do we lower that barrier? And I don't think we're doing a particularly great job at it right now. I think, and that is an important recognition as well, but there's a lot of energy to figure out how we can crack that down. It's a really important question.
Thank you.
Representative Rice?
Another different access question. I know we have a bill on our wall that deals with trail accessibility for people with physical disabilities. I was wondering if you can speak to any work that these organizations are doing on that front.
It's a great question. Accessibility has been really a focus, in particular over the last couple of years, realizing how much of our outdoor recreation infrastructure is not accessible. And I think the first thing is there's different grades and scales. So for example, again, I can speak for VIMBA. We work closely with Vermont Adaptive and Kelly Brush Foundation and have been conducting trail assessments throughout the state to figure out, are there low-hanging fruit we can do to modify and upgrade trails to make them accessible for folks that use adaptive equipment. Now, these are not ADA accessible trails, but these are, if you've seen, these are bikes that have 3 or 4 wheels. They're folks that have a disability of some kind, but they can use this equipment to actually get out on trails that mostly resemble mountain bike trails, but often, things like bridge width or specific impediments can make trails inaccessible. The ADA compliance is another step. So the cost of building an ADA compliant trail is an order of magnitude, if not more, than going out and building 18 or 2 feet of single track. So we're very much support the need to both build new ADA compliant trails and look where trails could be brought up to that standard, mindful that it's a big step to take. And so if we talk about, I think we want to be really thoughtful about how we do that in terms of whether those are mandates or whether those are incentives and funding that's available, because simply, I think the one thing I would communicate to say that, we should, to be thoughtful about, to simply say, all new trails, either a certain proportion or have you should be, let's say, ADA compliant, knowing that raises the cost dramatically and the complexity dramatically of building those trails. So it's something that when every single new trail we build now, as speaking for him, but we think about that adaptive accessibility from a mountain bike standpoint. And the question we ask ourselves is, why? Is there a reason this shouldn't be, at least accessible to adaptive equipment? Now, the bar you bring for ADA compliance in terms of grade and slope and a whole host of factors, that's another bar, but that's a similar question we want to ask ourselves, which is, is there a reason we wouldn't make this more accessible for everyone?
Great. All right. Well, I think we can have you continue that.
Wonderful. And I might pause too just for a moment. Cindy, I've been speaking a bunch. Is there anything you want to add on what's the conversation that's happened thus far?
You're muted, I think, Cindy.
Sorry, it looks like Representative O'Brien had his hand up before you called on me, Nick. So I would say start with him, and then I'm happy to jump in. I do have one thing to add, quick thing.
Thank you for pointing that out. Representative O'Brien, are you?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. Nick, one of your slides says the council serves as a voice for landowners. I also wondered if you serve as a voice for municipalities or maybe a mediator. In Tunbridge, we're in the middle of a lawsuit. The town's getting sued over legal trails and who should maintain them and improve them and who should have access to them. So, we're seeing all these pressures. VASA wants to have a trail system go through town to connect Royalton and Berkshire. VAST has been exemplary, I think, in their working with private landowners over the years. And so we're trying to figure out, what with these trail networks, they're sort of partly on class 4 roads, legal trails, private landowner trails, and just working out appropriate access for certain trails. Should some just be pedestrians or skiers, cross-country skiers? Should some be, open to motorized vehicles? So it'd be nice, right, if you could be a resource, I suppose, to sort of negotiate between these different communities.
Yeah, that's a great, and Cindy might be well equipped. You mentioned, do you want to jump in there, Cindy?
Sure. So that's a great question. So in the past, what we've done at VAST is try to work directly with the towns or with the municipality, following their lead, what they're looking for, and just offering support as to what we do. And, you know, I don't know about the circumstances in Tunbridge. I know that we do have trails down there ourselves and they've been established for a long time. So a lot of times people look at my own organization as a resource because we've been around for a long time. So more than happy to talk to the town if they want to reach out to me and see if, you know, any kind of support we can offer, because we do talk to a lot of different towns, as do all of these partner organizations within the Trails and Greenways Council, and we all have different experiences. So there are definitely things that we could bring to the table to help advise that maybe, you know, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, which we also partnership, which would be the on the attorney side for the town, we might be able to support those efforts of the town, and more than happy to do that.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. It's one thing that we ourselves have sort of recognized over the past couple of years, is that as recreation has grown in intensity and the volumes that we'll talk a little about best management practices in a minute, but really wanting to convert those into more usable tools and resources so that not just individual trail groups or landowners, but towns themselves can say, and I should mention, there are existing toolkits like the Town Forest Toolkit that talk about planning on a town parcel, but this is even taking a step back and helping and facilitating almost a master planning dialogue for a town to say, how do you work with landowners, trail organizations? You can't, it's a very interesting dynamic, because these are private landowners that can really decide what to do with their land and who and how, and if they let folks recreate. So it has to be more of a dialogue. And that's one thing, as we've worked with several towns recently across the state, is really trying to capture that this is the best sort of approach, is to have that dialogue and partnership between your town, have a town trails committee, ensure that all the Bolton is a good example, town of Bolton, have all the trail groups participate on that committee, have dialogue, and ensure that there's that sort of active conversation, and come up with an aspirational plan. Like, here's where we'd like our town to go. How can the individual organizations sort of contribute to that? So it's a really important thing, I think, particularly over the next couple of years, we need to put our energy into. And I think that's where, as we'll talk, like the resources to do that effectively are going to be pretty critical. Cindy, do you have one other thing you mentioned you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and Chair Durfee. The one thing I wanted to add was about the ADA compliant trails. As some of you might know, we've just transitioned, turning the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail over to VTrans exclusively, although we maintain it in the wintertime and we have agreements. But for the past many years, we've been the ones who have been paying and building, you know, and with federal and state dollars to get the Lamoille Valley Trail up and running. And personally, I used to be involved with Stowe Adaptive Sports. So I've always had a personal interest in ADA compliant trails. And to see this trail, which is 93 miles long once it's completed, as a space for folks to, in a safe environment, be able to recreate, whether it's using a hand cycle or a wheelchair or a walker or whatever it is pretty great. So while it's not a high impact trail, like a hiking trail and things like that, there are trails available for folks to get out. And that is important that we continue to grow that. In addition to growing the access to lower income Vermonters. I know at VAST, you know, we've always talked about it, the Trails and Greenways Council. How can we get folks out of more of an urban setting in a low cost way out into these outdoor recreation venues to introduce them to this sort of recreation? And lastly, municipalities, there's a few municipalities, and including the town of Morristown, that has a bike lending program where you can rent a bike for free. You just have to sign up to reserve it. And they have these bikes that have been donated. And there are families. I talked to a mother one day. She's got 3 kids, single mom, and that's her only way. They can't afford bikes. So it's her only way to use bikes. So there is a lot of thinking going on outside of the box and a lot more to do.
Great. So moving back, sort of one of the important roles that the council, the Trails and Greenways Council, plays is as an advisory body to the Agency of Natural Resources. And that crosses a couple of different sort of areas. One is with the Vermont Trail System. So as I mentioned before, the VTS, Vermont Trail System, is the official designation for public access trails in Vermont. So these trails that are on private land, you can apply for either based on the membership in the Trails and Greenways Council, or independent of that, apply for a trail to be recognized as this trail is open to the public. That then trail, or the trail itself, is then considered a municipal project or municipal good. So it has benefits associated with that, particularly related to Act 250 jurisdiction and thresholds. But so the trail system itself is an important designation that a particular trail is now, free to the public, open for all. The other bucket that we work with the A&R on is through is to help sort of steward the recreational trail program. So this takes Federal Highway Administration funds that the states receive to develop and maintain recreational trails. So that appropriation is critical. Those funds have funded an incredible amount of good work throughout the state for both motorized and non-motorized uses. So that's a program that we help guide through our advisory role. We also advise on the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative. I've dropped a recreation in the title there, but VOREC, which I suspect you all have heard about. We have 2 seats on the steering committee, one for motorized and non-motorized, and really work to help shepherd the pillars of VOREC, ensure that we're both advancing new recreation assets as well as keeping up with our stewardship responsibilities. And then similarly, we coordinate with A&R in terms of providing that voice of private land ownership and of the trail stewardship community on policy and legislation. And so then just from I cited on statute to the right here in terms of Title 10, Chapter 20, we have a couple different spots that just help outline what this role is. One is the statement of purpose for the Vermont trail system itself. One is a more clear description of what the Vermont trail system is. And then the third, which actually should say subsection 445, is what actually designates the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council as the advisory body. So I don't think I want to read statute, but I did want to include it in here just as a reference.
Good to know.
The next role and way we work with the state very closely is as a partner with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. And we do that across a couple of different functions. So one is Forest Parks and Rec itself is a critical landowner, effectively, if you think about it. So the state manages over 360,000 acres directly, along with another 130,000 through conservation easements. So when we think about, that 70% of private trail or public access trail on private land, there's still a huge portion remaining that's on public land. So it's critical that we work together to have really coherent, consistent policies, practices, and that we're moving together. We're actually designated to collectively manage the Vermont trail system itself. So applications as they come in, we work together to consider and approve those applications, as well as growing and improving, modifying that program over time. We coordinate on policy development and response. That's a critical role where as new ideas come to the fore, we really, as I mentioned, we want to take the vision of the sort of trail stewardship community from the private sector, as well as the public trail management, and make sure that we're thinking, that we're really sort of bouncing ideas off one another and coming up with a coherent support for or sort of challenges to ideas that are on the table for recreation. Many of our member organizations individually, VIMBO, the Mountain Bike Association being one of them, have cooperative or partnership agreements with FPR to manage and help steward trails on public land. And I tried to avoid putting mountain bike photos in this presentation because that is the other hat that I wear, but I did include one here, which is from Perry Hill, which is right close to where I live, which is a sort of a gem of a state parcel that has hosted and facilitated a lot of mountain bike activity. And VIMBA, as a stewardship organization, is the officially designated stewardship organization to support FPR in building and maintaining trails on state land. We also work together on, you may hear about it this year, the initiatives like the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. This is an every 5 years renewed plan that has to be signed by the governor that essentially is how are we going to sort of shepherd and move outdoor recreation forward over the next couple of years and work together to do that. FPR is the author of that plan, but we provide guidance and counsel to help put together that vision. And this year, 2023, is when the next one is effectively due. So it's a wonderful opportunity to really take stock and understand how we're going to advance our sort of collective recreation vision. And then, as I mentioned before, as we pride ourselves on the BMPs that we implement, and in doing that, given the important role that FPR plays in managing state land, we work together and the expertise FPR brings to really understand how we can best deploy and convert those best management practices into tools that trail organizations can use. So in short, we do a lot with FPR. I've mentioned a couple of times now best management practices, and this is just a term you may hear come up in legislation or when we talk about what the Trails and Greenways Council and the Vermont Trail System means. So first off, what do we mean by best management practices? So the Forest Service came up with this term over 3 decades ago. and it was related to practices pertaining to water quality, to really protect and promote good water quality in forestry activities. It's evolved over time, but it can be related to a structural thing, how you build a bridge, for example, on the right, or it can be a part of a process, how you engage the public, how you plan, anything like that. So those are both qualify as BMPs. And so as we've defined it, it's a practice or combination of practices determined to be effective and practicable, that's really important, means of minimizing impact and or maximizing the sustainability and user experience of a trail. There's a lot in there, but it incorporates a lot of, we think about both that idea of maximizing the positive impacts trails have and minimizing the negative impacts that trails have in terms of environmental and others. So it's something that's, it's several decades old as a concept. And I included here some images from the vast BMP manual. This, I believe, is from the 2017 edition, where really being very specific about how to plan for, design, and construct a bridge, and then having a quality finished product, which you see there on the right. So critical to the work we do. We're not out there just building trails for building trails' sake, but applying some really thoughtful practices in doing so. The rationale and why, and this is just to dig deeper, there's several reasons that BMPs are really critical and why we've established across our organizations and follow these BMPs. One is establishing value and purpose for a trail. So every trail, before we construct or think about it, what experience or what will this accomplish in terms of providing access or a new experience or linking trails together. So it really forces that assessment of what value is this trail bringing. Next one is environmental impacts. So the idea of how do we minimize the effects on water quality, on soil, on erosion, on natural habitat. So being thoughtful about the minimizing that environmental footprint. The third one is the social and community impact. So wanting to be thoughtful about negative impacts like parking and congestion, but actually beneficial for thinking about access to schools and other, positive economic benefits and things like that. So where parking is sited, where trailheads are located, things like that are brought into those type of BMPs. Fourth one's legal, to ensure that we're compliant with all permitting and those type of things. And then the fifth one is efficiency, which is, as we think about building trails, these BMPs help ensure that they're done right the first time and they're done in a way that minimizes cost so that trails can be done. And so you can get sort of the most bang for your buck. And the example I gave here, this is the Burroughs Trail, which folks may be familiar with. It's an over 2 mile trail that effectively follows a fall line up Campbell's Hump area. This is the original build, which over years you can see without really, this is prior to BMPs existing over 100 years ago. You see erosion, you see user widening of the trail, you see really negative consequences all around. This is not particularly fun to use, nor is it good for the natural environment. When we brought in more modern trail building techniques, what you actually see is that these are projects that need to be conducted throughout the state, because Vermont has a pretty old trail infrastructure, which is bringing actually stonework in. This is done with a high line and a lot of pry bars and a lot of sweat equity, bringing rocks in to actually redefine the path that users will take, minimize their off-trail usage. Think about, and a lot of work here has been done, some of which isn't pictured, in terms of minimizing erosion impacts and revegetation. So there's a huge difference in terms of the impacts trails have when BMPs are followed versus when they're not, or as I mentioned with some of our older trails that were constructed long before we had well-established best management practices. And then just a last note on BMPs is I kind of alluded to this, is that they really cut across many different categories. This isn't purely related to construction. This starts in the planning and design process. So we have BMPs pertaining to how you engage with communities, how you think about the purpose of a trail and the siting of a trail, those type of things. BMPs then to construction, as the bridge example alluded to. Management practices then related to use, so how users are going to actually take advantage, how you actually minimize user conflict and manage use of trails. And then lastly, maintenance as well, in terms of how to take care of those trails over time. So there's we have some sort of trail agnostic or use agnostic, I should say, management practices. But then as you drill down, whether it's a snowmobile trail, a mountain bike trail, hiking trail, these get very specific. So it would be quite a list to try to put them all on one page. But just to sort of highlight that these run the gamut of different best practice categories. Probably pause there if that's right, and after questions just on BMPs.
Yeah, questions about best management practices? Representative Wilson.
How often do you get confronted by unruly bikers? I know East Burke area, it got so popular up there that there was landowners closed their land access because bikers they didn't want to spend a lot of money because their bikes are so expensive. They camped out in the land, caused probably not a lot of people, it was probably few, but it made landowners angry. How often are you confronted with that?
The good news is not often. The bad news is it doesn't take much. It takes one or two. And the part of that, and this is a question that we as a collective community, mountain bikers specifically, but across the board, we have to be seen by the public and our partners as that's an anomaly. That's an outlier. That's somebody who's not following the rules. And this idea of an ethic, a trail ethic, which we've worked with, and FPR is helping lead on really the how do we establish a trail ethic in Vermont. And as our individual groups, it's about etiquette. So we've identified, I can speak for VIMBA, we're about to publish a 5-year strategic plan where one of our major goals is really related to etiquette and to informing ridership. And as we think about BMPs, that falls in that use and management bucket. It's not enough to build a great trail and take good care of it. You have to shepherd the people who are actually using that trail through. Part of it's signage and communications, and part of it is just that social pressure of it's not okay to behave like that, and ensuring people realize that you're a welcomed guest. We have now programs like the Ride with Gratitude campaign up that started in the Northeast Kingdom. Bike Borderlands initiated it, but now VIMBA follows it, and the New England Mountain Bike Association and the rest of New England have adopted it as well, which is really about enforcing that ethic of respect. Yeah, but it's a huge concern because it can undermine, and we've seen that you mentioned the example in Kingdom Trails, but there are elsewhere through the state where, if you're a landowner, again, you have nothing sticking you to holding these. There's no tax benefit you'll lose if you take away public access to those trails. So sometimes it could be the second or third time you come out with somebody misbehaving on your property. It's not necessarily a big threshold to say, I'm done letting folks land my land.
Yeah, I think it was just a few, but a couple landowners were angry.
And the other sort of important part there is actually how users work with one another. So on shared use trails with for example, equestrians and bikers and hikers and stuff, the value of having something like the Trails and Greenways Council and it's actually unique really in the country where you have all different use types getting together and working collaboratively, is we can really help address those user conflict concerns. So part of it is landowner respect and part of it is user respect, because you want to make sure that mountain bikers understand if you see a horse coming on the trail, you need to step aside, or a snowmobile in the wintertime. You mentioned fat biking, that step aside, let them ride. Like there has to be consistency. So by having a body that cuts across usage, you can help foster those attitudes as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Specifically for legislators, we did want to highlight a couple of it. We got together as a group this summer and polled all of our members and aligned on what is it that we would like to see in terms of the legislative outcomes. And a couple sort of rose to the top. The first relates to Act 250. So it's really to not take any immediate action. Periodically people view, and Act 250, we universally agree is not the right mechanism to regulate trails. But we're also at a spot now where we're building up what we believe is a longer term plan for what an alternative could look like. We're in no hurry to change it right now, knowing that about 2 years ago, an effort was made to come up with an alternative, and it realized that we don't really have a good alternative waiting in place, and that folks didn't have clear enough alignment in terms of what that alternative would look like. So that first one is, as much as folks view that as maybe a blanket way to, hey, we could make it easier to build and maintain trail, as much as we agree with the principle, let's all take a break, because that immediately puts people into sort of taking positions where there's not necessarily clear alignment on what that alternative would look like. The second is from a funding standpoint. So as a council, we have, despite this statutory role we play as an advisory body, we have no official funding, and we bring our member organizations sort of borrowed time from folks like Cindy and myself shepherd this body through. And one of the things that we realized over the next couple of years is in order to professionalize the Trails and Greenways Council, we need to secure a sustainable funding pathway. Related to that, we actually believe in institutional capacity for FPR is critical. So Vermont Forest Parks and Rec has seen the same doubling and tripling of usage of resources. And so more recreational support being absolutely essential in the department, and to help them do their jobs and work with us. The fourth bullet, there are some specific areas in which Act trails their jurisdiction applies to trails currently under Act 250. And these are like the definition of a project is actually not well defined by what it means to do a trail project, and when that, is that purely new construction? Is that maintenance? How much magnitude? That type of thing. So there's some nuances, clarifications, which I'm happy to follow with a list, but these are related to, as I mentioned, things like defining a project. And lastly, we view, I think, as I mentioned before, the current use program or use value appraisal program is an incredibly valuable tool to to essentially curb development and allow things like forestry, agriculture, and conservation to persist on parcels. We'd love to see over time, and really we know that that's a huge nut to crack, but at least to try to put a roadmap together that is there a way to consider recreation and to acknowledge the value that providing public access recreation plays on private land. So sort of laying the path for what would we need to do to come up with what a proposal could look like to incorporate recreation into current use.
Question, Nick. Wondering how much of a private land that's currently made available for public access is already enrolled?
It's a great question, and a decent amount of it, I think, and Cindy might know. I'll pause in a second to see if Cindy has a number at hand, but a significant amount of it, recreation is very compatible, obviously, with usage of current use. So this would be, in many cases, I've heard it referred to as an adder or a benefit that might lay on top of the existing program. But it's a good question. I'll come back with an actual number.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add.
Cindy, were you gonna, you unmuted, I see.
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add to that. It is, I mean, we definitely, I know for VAST, we use a lot of farmland, a lot of forest product land, and private lands. You know, we have about 9,500 private landowners statewide just for VAST itself. And quite a few of those are in the use value appraisal program already. But I don't know that we have an exact number.
Representative Lipsky.
Nick, do you work with any or many municipal planning boards who are constantly updating town plans or recreation plans? Because even back 60, 50 years ago, we added, when we were drafting town plans, trail networks down in Windham County up in Winhall, because municipal planning commissions, which are now tasked with looking to the future and particularly against development for housing stock in village areas, what you bring to a community with these trail systems. And I would urge you to consider that may be a venue where you can expand trail networks. Just a thought. Let you do that already.
No, it's a great question. We recently reached out to all, I guess, 261, I forget the exact number, of townships, with just inviting those towns to participate in the council and also identifying the resources that we bring. In many cases, it comes down to the actual active trail groups in those communities and then participating in those, those meetings, or if there's a trails committee, and figuring out sort of that's often sort of takes place at the local level. But that's a really great point in terms of, as we think about further investing in and developing these tools, I think tools for communities to understand how do we incorporate recreation to that vision is really valuable.
Representative Templeton.
Were there any ARPA grants that helped you or are helping you in any of these programs? I'm just thinking, specifically for my community of Brownington, we have an extensive trail system that isn't incorporated into any organization. And if we would be eligible for further development through grants, and maybe even through partnering with your council, that might be a way forward.
It's a good question. And Cindy you might know more about ARPA or have more experience.
I don't, but I can speak on the transportation advisory committees that the RCPs have. I used to sit on the one for Lamoille County, and they're very involved with trails, and conversations are happening.
A good example that recently was the URSA program from, I believe, last year, this Enhanced Recreation Stewardship and Access program, which the state, the Forest Parks and Recreation administered, which was $1 million really to promote access and accessibility, but also promote stewardship of a program that came from ARPA funds. And those are available to communities as well as nonprofit groups. And there are good examples too. I mean, Randolph is an excellent one where groups are working. We have a mountain bike chapter there that's working closely with the town. The town applied for VOREC funding, received that to help do a big community project related to the Bellamont Trail coming through there. So there are really examples of sort of town and nonprofit partnerships that have sought after and received grant funding. But I think one thing we do, it's come up in the context of rural development this session as well, as there's how do we help small communities access more funding to develop and from our perspective, really maintain these assets, which I think is you kind of noting in your community, there are these trails there. The question is, how do we bring in the sort of structure and rigor to promote, maintain, steward them over time? And that's, I think, a big nut to crack in the years ahead. Right. So the last thing that we wanted to mention as well, which there is even as I, opened this with the idea that recreation will be likely in front of you in different forms this session. There's a bill that was recently released, House 131, which is an act relating to the creation of the Green Mountain Fund. That bill would create a dedicated role for the council to really fulfill its statutory role and activities to help do some investment in some of these resources, operationalization of our BMPs to create more and better tools. It also creates roles in FPR for both to help oversee and manage the Vermont trail system. We envision over the next couple of years really strengthening the VTS to not only be something that represents public access trails, but incorporates a lot of these BMPs within it. And secondly, a role to administer a Green Mountain Recreation Fund. And as we were talking about just a moment ago, that fund would really be focused on a couple of things. One is organizational capacity. So nonprofits in this doubling and tripling of trail usage have gotten to the point where many are hiring part-time or full-time staff. And we're seeing a lot of the volunteer or pure volunteerism model kind of breaking at it or fracturing, I guess I'll put it that way, in terms of the stressors that's put on groups that are trying to work purely out of spare time. And then grants as well for municipalities to advance the objectives of VORAC, which there's two pillars in VORAC that are quite critical. One is related to the development of new recreation infrastructure, and the second is related to stewardship. So that's a bill that we're really excited to see come down because it's the first, or in a while, really recognition of the importance of stewardship. We really believe in the idea of new trail projects and funding that's been made available for those in the recent years. But we also really want the legislature to think carefully on how to support the stewardship commitments that we've already made by the trails that we have across our state. So just a shout out to look carefully at that, and we'd be more than happy to come in and provide testimony or input if and as you see helpful. And that's it for us. I think, again, just wanted to echo our thanks that it was, really delightfully good chance to meet all of you, share a little about who we are and what we do, and certainly happy to take additional questions.
Thank you. We can't see Representative O'Brien, so John, if you wanted to jump in, and good, please jump in.
Okay, thank you. No, going back to the wanting to perhaps gain more access through current use program, I wondered if you could speak to, I've heard when land is conserved that oftentimes a provision with that is access to public recreation. And if you partner with the Vermont Land Trust and other land trusts in Vermont, how that would work. There's even a bill floating around to conserve 30% of Vermont by 2030 and how that would affect the trails organizations going forward.
Yeah, Cindy, do you want to jump in first? I know you have some perspective, but I'm happy to weigh in as well.
Sure. So I know specifically for our organization, we do work with the land trust. We do have easements. We have our own Vermont Snow Trails Conservancy, our own charitable organization, specifically for snowmobile easements. But we also work for a variety of smaller, like the Stowe Land Trust. We have easements and agreements with them, the Vermont Land Trust. And so we do. Sometimes they're purchasing a very large easement that none of us would be able to purchase on our own. So we all join together to get the funds together to be able to purchase an easement.
The one thing I'd add as well, I think that's helpful. We likewise have many partnerships with land trusts that have baked in recreation into those conservation easements. We've been having dialogue recently too with, for example, Vermont Natural Resources Council on how we could think about, we've discussed the sort of recreation adder, but they too recognize a need to sort of augment the conservation piece that's in current use as well, because the construct, it's a little finicky in terms of folks actually being able to take use of that unless it's officially held, those easements in terms of the constraints and how they're held. So that's one of the ways in which that we've been working or having dialogue presently with VNRC and others about if we were to think about ways, tweaks to current use, doing that sort of together, conservation and recreation being two things we could look at sort of strengthening. And the point that you make is a really good one, Representative O'Brien, in terms of the fact that you can oftentimes sort of solidify or in some ways make permanent recreation access through those conservation easements, or more permanent, I should say. So we view, if done right, there's a really big opportunity there to recognize recreation through the program.
Committee, any other questions? Representative Grant?
Is Vermont Trails and Greenways Council, is that a state sanctioned council or is that a private?
So we're a private entity, or we're a nonprofit organization founded back in the, I think, late 80s, but we are officially recognized as an advisory body in statute, but we are an independent organization itself.
I was gonna ask earlier and I then forgot to, greenways. What are greenways? What are greenways?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Cindy may have a good input here too. I mean, I think she brought up the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, but the thinking of recognition that the things like the Cross Vermont Trail, which itself, the sort of, sometimes a hard distinction has been made between natural surface trails in the woods and things like that versus bike paths or gravel paths or converted rail beds. And to my understanding, at least again, the name many years ago, but is designed to capture any of those sort of pedestrian and sort of non-vehicular sort of access ways, whether they be things like the LVRT or the rail trails that have gained popularity, or the natural surface trails that go through the woods. So just trying to take a big tent sort of vision of what are we talking about when we mean trails. But to your questions, which is a good one, we kind of think of those as trails sort of in our mind. But Cindy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I mean, I think that was just the name that was chosen back in the day. But I will talk about the statutory role that we have. That's a good question, whether we're a private or a public entity and that we're sanctioned. So we are our own nonprofit. We have a small dues because we believe that one voice is not more important than the other. One organization that might have a lot more money than the other does not outweigh anyone's importance or voice. And we do, in statute, it does say who has to be on the board of directors and who sits at this table. And that also includes the state agencies. And as Nick mentioned, our statutory role as an advisory council to the Agency of Natural Resources is in statute.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we'll wrap up there. We are back at 1 o'clock. The committee. Thank you, Cindy. We'll be meeting as usual on Thursday.